Welcome back. The Wizard of Oz is an immortal classic of a film. From its memorable songs to its genius of a shift from sepia tone to Technicolor, purely to show off film technology at the time, it will always be fondly remembered. Although many people do forget that when it was first released, it was a colossal box office flop. However, what won't be as fondly remembered is its sequel.
Come here, chicken!
Its far darker sequel, Return to Oz. Now, I say sequel. I personally think of it as a sequel because it makes a nice transition from the happy clappy tone of the first film to something more adult here. But it was never the intention to make a direct sequel. However, having said that, this film does repeat a few elements from the first film just to ease the transition for the audience, which, understandably, had the opposite effect of confusing people.
Return to Oz stars Fairuza Balk in her first ever acting role as Dorothy Gale, and takes place 6 months after the first film. And as I mentioned, Return to Oz is kind of famous for being incredibly dark and scary for a children's film.
Which is naturally why I like it so much.
Return to Oz was directed by Walter Murch, who's much more well known as a sound and editing guy, and this is the only film he ever directed, possibly because of the bad blood generated between him and the studio over budget concerns and slow filming pace.
He was actually fired merely a week into production, but thanks to Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas and Steven Spielberg rallying behind Murch, he was rehired and managed to finish the film on schedule. But as the way these things seem to go, studio management changed and the film received a limited theatrical run and limited production, making its chances slight at best. That, coupled with the confusion about whether it's a sequel or not, and people expecting something more akin to the Judy Garland film, it was never going to go well, sadly.
But on the subject of that dark tone, there's a very good short interview with Murch about the tone, and he says Return to Oz was never meant to be scary. At least, that wasn't his intention.
And really, I can see his point. Because every aspect of this film was at the very least mentioned somewhere in one of the books. The books do have quite dark things sometimes, and Walter Murch was just recreating that as closely as possible.
And if you look at the first film, you can see dark images here and there.
But as Murch puts it in the interview, because it has songs, because it's clearly men painted to look like creatures, there's that disconnect there with reality, and as such, makes it less scary. Although people were scared of parts of it at the time, that's the basic idea. But Walter Murch says it better than I ever could, so if you're interested, go check out that interview here on YouTube.
Now, like I said, this isn't a direct sequel to the first film, more of an unofficial spiritual successor. A possible reason for this is that the Judy Garland film was made by MGM, and this is a Disney production, so aspects of the previous film, which were reused, had to be rented out for this sequel, or just not mentioned, because Disney has the rights to 13 of the Oz books, except the first one, and Return to Oz is based on an amalgamation of the second and third books.
However, I do think its poor reception is why it wasn't more widely embraced into the canon. It was also a box office flop as well, but so was the original, so that's irrelevant. It got decidedly mixed reviews, with the majority of the criticism coming down to it being far too dark and intense. At least that's what they said. I watched it as a child and I turned out just fine.
And I do find it quite appropriately hilarious that of all the people to come to the defense of Return to Oz, it was Harlan Ellison, the famously curmudgeonly bastard who wrote I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, who said, quote, "It ain't Judy Garland, it ain't hip-hop, but it's in the tradition of the original Oz books."
And if that doesn't convince you that this film is worthwhile, I don't know what will. So with all that out of the way, this is Return to Oz.
We begin with a view of the night sky, and as the camera pulls out, it's actually being reflected in a mirror as our Dorothy, played by a very young Veruza Balk, lays awake at night unable to sleep. And this is not an isolated incident, as Aunt Em, played by the legendary Piper Laurie, talks with Dorothy about this problem, while her Uncle Henry reads an article from the paper about a revolutionary electrical healing method.
One of the biggest themes in this film is that of mental health, which is remarked on many times in a variety of different ways. And it makes sense. After all, it's questioned in the first film whether Dorothy did indeed go to Oz, or was it all in her head, since people in her real life appeared in this fantasy world as well. This film just took it one step further and made it a central idea.
Henry doesn't think they have the money for Dorothy's treatment, and there's a brief argument over getting money from a family member. This is also where we learn the tornado was 6 months ago, and Dorothy hasn't stopped talking about her experience in Oz. And while they talk, Dorothy sees a shooting star and thinks it may be important. The next day, Dorothy and Toto are running around disturbing the chickens, which is when we meet the de facto Toto for this film, Bellina the chicken, who hasn't been laying any eggs lately. And we all know chickens that don't lay get put in the stew.
Yes, the mental health theme goes so deep, even the chickens got problems.
And while rooting around, Bellina finds a mysterious key laying on the ground, and it doesn't escape Dorothy's notice that the key's design is an O and a Z, which she shows to Aunt Em as proof of Oz, but Aunt Em is sure it's a key to the old house.
That's a big thing this film does very well. On one hand, you can see this film at face value, and Dorothy's soon-to-be fantastical adventure is real. Or you could choose to see it as the hallucinations of a troubled mind. The film gives adequate evidence for both.
And of course it's implied, for now, that the shooting star was the key falling from the sky sent by some unseen force. Dorothy is worried that there's something wrong with Oz, but her aunt is stern, telling her not to talk about it, and is much more worried about the farm. And the mental health theme shows up again, as Dorothy says Uncle Henry broke his leg in the tornado, but Aunt Em says his leg is mended, it's more his spirit that is still broken. So the next day they're off to see the doctor, the wonderful doctor of... Okay. And just to dispel another similarity with the first film, Toto tries to follow Dorothy, but she quite sternly tells him to just go home.
The two books this film is based on is The Marvelous Land of Oz and Ozma of Oz, the former of which Dorothy doesn't appear in at all, and Ozma of Oz primarily doesn't even take place in the Land of Oz, but the neighbouring land of Ev.
And apparently the name Oz came from Frank L. Baum's filing cabinet, which had drawers listed as A to G, H to N, and O to Z.
It's as simple as that. It is a shame that he didn't keep the convention going, though, and call the second land Ag, but Ev does sound more fantastical.
After a long ride through Kansas, Dorothy and Aunt Em eventually reach Dr. Worley's hospital. Dr. Worley, played by another legend, Nicole Williamson, inspects the key Dorothy found. And I don't think it's a coincidence that not only is he wearing a ruby ring, he's also smoking a pipe.
And that pipe specifically is a meerschaum pipe. And to explain briefly, because I do have a point here.
Meerschaum pipes, if you're not familiar, are made from a very particular type of soapstone. Meerschaum being German for seafoam, which is a reference to its natural white colour and the fact that it's occasionally found floating in the ocean.
So the fact that the first things we see of Worley are a ruby and a pipe made of stone might be a bit of visual foreshadowing for later.
And while Worley looks at the key, Dorothy tells him the story of how the Tin Man became the Tin Man.
And as I said, the Oz books have quite a bit of darkness to them. And as the story goes, the Tin Woodsman accidentally cut his leg off and replaced it with tin. A witch then enchanted his axe and cut up his entire body until he was all made of tin. But yeah, this film's too dark.
Also, if you listened carefully to what Dorothy says...
But then a witch enchanted his axe, and he kept on cutting off all the other parts of his body.
You can hear she starts to say hacking instead of cutting. The studio thought the word hacking was too graphic a word for the film, so they changed it. Dr. Worley asks about other things in Oz, like the Cowardly Lion. He also asks Dorothy how she got back from Oz.
With my ruby slippers.
And this is an aspect that they kept from the first film, because unless you know the books, you wouldn't know
that the ruby slippers were an invention of the Judy Garland film. In the original book, Dorothy actually had silver shoes. It was changed to ruby in the film purely because they wanted to show off the Technicolor film, and red pops more on screen.
There's actually an interpretation about the silver shoes that, personally, I find hilarious because it's so ridiculous. But some analysts have interpreted a political and economic message to the Wizard of Oz.
The yellow brick road represents the gold standard, which is a monetary standard in the economic unit of account, which is based on a fixed quantity of gold. And the silver shoes represent the Silverite 16:1 silver ratio.
The Silverites were members of a political movement in the late 19th century who advocated that silver should be the monetary standard. Oh, and the City of Oz was so named because it's the abbreviation for ounces, the measures for gold and silver. Ooh, spooky. Except the entire theory is nonsense. I've already explained why it's called Oz. They're children's books, for God's sake. This just seems like another case of not seeing the forest for the trees.
Anyway, Dorothy tells Wally how to use the slippers, but unfortunately she can't show him since they were lost when she was travelling back to Kansas, which will be important later. We then learn about Dr. Wally's treatment as he shows Dorothy a machine that he says has a face. Dorothy asks if it will hurt, but Wally assures her that it won't. It just manages electrical current.
We'll get to the actual treatment later, but it's significant that this machine has a face and it's operated through the turning of keys and things. I may be looking into it too much, but I always felt that this was more visual foreshadowing.
Wally seems quite enamoured by the march of progress into the 20th century, extolling the virtues of electricity to Aunt Em, and while he talks, Dorothy sees a girl in the glass of the machine, but it's a reflection of someone looking through the window at her, who quickly disappears when Dr. Wally talks to Dorothy again. Dorothy is being left at the hospital, and she is in the capable hands of Jean Marsh's Nurse Wilson. And it's certainly no coincidence that she's wearing a very similar outfit to the Wicked Witch of the West. After Aunt Em leaves, being reassured that Dorothy will be fine, she's taken by Nurse Wilson, and we hear the squeaky wheel of an orderly pushing a gurney. Again, plenty of foreshadowing that will be capitalized on later.
Also, the orderly is played by Pons Ma, who is quite the MVP for this film, playing at least 3 different characters and also being the mime movement arranger for arguably the most memorable characters of the entire film, which I will talk about in a bit.
Dorothy is taken to a rather dingy-looking patient room and watches forlornly as Aunt Em rides away. It's then the girl from earlier appears in Dorothy's room holding a carved pumpkin.
Foreshadowing! Foreshadowing everywhere!
The girl has to rush off just as thunder starts to rumble. However, Dorothy doesn't hear her open and close the door. She just disappears. Dorothy waits in her room, and I might be interpreting this wrong, but it feels intentional that Dorothy turns the light switch on without really knowing how to do it, because she might not have seen electric lights at all, or at least have very limited experience. Eventually, Dorothy starts to hear wheels squeaking down the corridor, and boy do they milk the tension on that, with a slow shot of the door getting closer and closer. Nurse Wilson eventually appears with a gurney and the orderly, making sure to strap Dorothy into it, which seems a bit unnecessary. She's then taken to what seems to be an operating room.
Now, I've defended the dark tone of this film so far, but I have to admit, this could be straight out of Jacob's Ladder. Especially because Dorothy asks if she could hear screaming. However, this film came out 5 years before Jacob's Ladder, so perhaps it's the other way round.
Dr. Wally greets Dorothy again and gets the machine ready to deliver the electric shocks. Basically, what we're seeing here is an electroconvulsive therapy session.
Which, I'm compelled to point out, is not as scary a thing as movies make it look. ECT is a valid form of therapy and is still in use today. Yes, it looks dramatic, but it genuinely does help people with a variety of disorders. The only difference with the modern day version is that it's done under anaesthetic and with muscle relaxants.
Now, having said that, I do think ECT is way overkill to use on a 9-year-old who, let's be honest, just has insomnia. The device is placed on Dorothy, and again, take note of the key being turned on the front of the machine. However, just before the switch is thrown, lightning cuts the power to the hospital and Dorothy is left alone in the room, and all she can hear is the screaming of the patients, and the key in the machine slowly winding down. Again, significant. The girl from earlier suddenly appears once again to rescue Dorothy from the gurney, and Dorothy again asks about the screaming she can hear. The girl tells her it's the damaged patients who have been locked in the cellar.
This is something that will never be addressed in this film, possibly because they thought it was too dark a plot point. In this film? Yeah, I know. However, there is something about it in the novelization, which I'll talk about later.
They both run, having to hide briefly from the orderlies as they make their escape. They manage to get down the stairs, but are caught by Nurse Wilson as they run outside. The girl falls into the river and Dorothy jumps in after her, but a branch breaks away and they both float down the river. Fortunately, they find what's supposed to be a chicken coop to hold on to, but the girl, once again, disappears, as Dorothy climbs inside the coop to survive the river.
Now, I agree with some critics that said that that was quite a perilous situation for a kids' movie. However, is it more perilous than a frickin' tornado? I doubt it. And as Walter Murch says, because it's not clearly some vaudevillian production on an obvious soundstage, it almost adds to the peril accidentally.
Rather strangely, despite Kansas being a landlocked state, Dorothy finds herself floating on a large ocean. I mean, Milford Lake, the largest lake in Kansas, is 64 kilometers wide, so maybe that's it, but it's doubtful.
Also, this situation is quite similar to what happens to Dorothy in Ozma of Oz. There, she falls overboard a ship bound for Australia and floats out to sea, where she does indeed use a chicken coop to survive. That's why I suspected it was a chicken coop.
Dorothy, who has managed to sleep through her ordeal, is woken up by the sounds of a chicken, and rather surprisingly, it's Billina, who can now, for some reason, talk.
The implication being that the magic of Oz has allowed Billina to talk. Of course, why that didn't happen to Toto is anyone's guess. And in the book, Ozma of Oz, Billina is just a chicken that Dorothy finds when she lands in Ev. Because as I said, Ozma of Oz doesn't take place in Oz. And I do like that the film gave some prior history with Billina. And I've already said Oz way too many times, and we're only 30 minutes in.
Dorothy gets up to look around and finds all the water, apart from the puddle they're in, has disappeared, leaving a vast desert on the edge of a verdant green field. Dorothy asks how Billina learned to talk, but no real explanation is given. She just says that if they were in Oz, Billina talking wouldn't be strange. And yeah, they just move on from that. The penny eventually drops, and they both realise they've returned to Oz. However, Dorothy has to stop Billina from jumping onto the sand, because Dorothy knows that they are in the deadly desert.
How she knows that, though, is never explained. It's just assumed that Dorothy knows all about Oz. Also, in the books, the deadly desert is indeed a thing. It's a large desert that stretches between the lands of Oz and the land of Ev, separating the two. This is the closest the film will get to referencing Ev, though.
Rather gruesomely, Dorothy explains that anything living that touches the deadly desert turns to sand. And again, this is something definitely in the books. So get out of here with your "this film's too dark" crap. Dorothy uses the stones to avoid touching the sand, but unknown to her, something seems to be watching her. Something that is part of the stones.
We'll get to see more of it in a bit, but I just wanted to say that the stop-motion effects for this film are truly incredible, and I will be detailing the frankly incredible process later.
While walking around, they come across a lunch pail tree. I know, just go with it. And have a small picnic while once again something watches from a nearby rock before disappearing. We then see that creature inform an unknown third party that Dorothy has returned to Oz. However, when he also says that Dorothy has a chicken with her...
He doesn't like the sound of that, I think. This will get explained, but the creature we are seeing is a gnome, spelled N-O-M-E. Frank L. Baum removed the G from the word gnome to make it easier to read for children. And in the lore of the Oz books, gnome means one who knows, because gnomes catalogue all mining locations obsessively. Also, the depiction of gnomes in the film is quite different to their more traditional-looking book representation. But it does say that gnomes can only exist underground and are half human, half made of stone, being able to cling to rocks like flies.
So the film just took it one step further and made them a bit more unique and interesting, and I must admit that I love this interpretation of a gnome. Instead of being a pointy-hatted character, they actually inhabit the rocks themselves, and I love how they don't necessarily move, but instead cause the rocks to grow and shrink to fit their movement. It's a really great effect. Dorothy and Bellina are searching for anyone she might know, finding the place eerily quiet. And that's when they come across Dorothy's old house. She points out each room and even showing Bellina where she landed on the Wicked Witch of the East. However, there's an obvious problem, as originally the house was smack bang in Munchkin Town, but now there's nothing, just a forest. And that's when Dorothy sees the yellow brick road, all smashed and torn up from the ground, causing Dorothy to run off as she knows something terrible has happened. Also, notice the clever, subtle detail and foreshadowing that the road seems to have been torn up from underneath. The messenger once again talks with his superior, telling him what Dorothy has found, and the voice ominously says they won't get past Mombi.
Now, interestingly, Mombi, a character from the books, is not the same as the Mombi in this film. This version of the character has more in common with a character called Princess Languidire, who is from the Ozma of Oz book and is part of the ruling family of the land of Ev. Also, she's not an antagonist, whereas Mombi is definitely an antagonist here.
Dorothy gets to the end of the yellow brick road, a lot sooner than she did in the first film, come to think of it. Must have been all that singing. But anyway, the city is far from bustling and is in fact looking quite dilapidated.
This aspect of the film, the Emerald City being destroyed, isn't actually in any of the books. Although it did get taken over by a Munchkin general named Ginger who deposed the Scarecrow as its ruler once. But the destroyed part seems to be more of a reference to the Chronicles of Narnia book Prince Caspian, strangely, which had this exact same scenario happen to Lucy in that book.
Dorothy walks around the now abandoned city as we see the stone carvings. Firstly, this Oz crest, which actually looks quite similar to the key Dorothy found. And then there's this thing,
which is a Laimonege, a creature with the head of a lion, body of a monkey, and wings of an eagle. And it's a very accurate and faithful recreation of the illustration on the back of the Magic of Oz book. And I suspect it's in this film as a sort of tribute to Frank L. Baum, because the Magic of Oz was released originally only a few weeks after his death.
However, as we see more of the city, there's not just carvings, but statues everywhere. But Dorothy can recognise that they are actually people who have been turned to stone.
I also like how the people who have been turned to stone look quite different to the stone walls, making it more obvious that they are unnatural things that shouldn't be there.
Dorothy also reads some ominous graffiti on a wall that reads, "Beware the Wheelers." And she says that she doesn't remember them from the first time she was in Oz.
Which is interesting because in the book, the Wheelers come from the land of Ev, so it makes sense why Dorothy doesn't know them. For the film, though, their presence is completely unexplained.
It's then Dorothy starts to hear the squeaking of wheels all around her, the same squeaking the wheel of the hospital gurney made earlier, and strange creatures are seen briefly moving between cover. However, they seem to be keeping their distance for now. And to add to that macabre feeling, Dorothy finds the statue of 6 dancing women, all of whom have been decapitated. It's then Bellina is spooked by the statue of the Tin Woodsman raising his axe in combat. And it's not just him, but the Cowardly Lion has also been turned to stone.
I'm sure it hasn't escaped your notice that the Cowardly Lion and the Tin Man are a much more faithful depiction of the characters. This really shows the love that Walter Murch had for the original books, because these designs really evoke the same feeling of the illustrations from the book, while being a unique design for the film.
While Dorothy laments the loss of her friends, it's then the Wheelers make their presence known.
Come here, chicken!
And you can really see why they're some of the most memorable aspects of this film. because they are quite horrifying.
As stated before, the Wheelers are in the Ozma of Oz book and reside in the land of Ev. Now, in the film, they are very much a dangerous antagonist to Dorothy, but in the book, it's stated that although they will act aggressive and be annoying, they're not actually inherently dangerous. Also, apart from the creepy face hats, they are described pretty much the same in the book.
Although Marvel did a run of Oz-based comics, and I think their version of the Wheelers didn't just one-up the creepy factor of the film, but roundhouse kicked it into the sun.
Also, another rather creepy detail about the Wheelers, it says in the book that the wheels on their hands and feet are actually made of the same material as human fingernails, which feels like some Cronenberg levels of just wrong.
Also, the fact that the Wheelers have the same squeaky wheels as the hospital gurney is made even more relevant because the lead Wheeler is played by Pons Ma, the hospital orderly. And I have to show some behind the scenes of Pons Ma practicing with the wheels, cause it's really amazing how he managed to figure out a method of movement with them that not only works under the actor's own power, but also looks really fluid and dynamic. Anyway, the Wheelers chase Dorothy and Billina into a seemingly dead end, but fortunately Dorothy sees a keyhole hidden in the stone, and using the key she found, she enters a secret room to keep safe for now. The head Wheeler does some taunting through the keyhole, and Dorothy says that she hasn't done anything wrong, but the Wheelers claim her lunch pail is stolen. But worse is the chicken, and he says the Gnome King doesn't allow chickens. And when Dorothy asks who the Gnome King is, well, she doesn't exactly get a straight answer.
Who is the Gnome King?
I can answer that though. The Gnome King is the lead antagonist of the Ozma of Oz book as well as others, and apart from his appearance, is arguably the most accurately recreated character because he serves pretty much the exact same purpose.
The Wheelers eventually roll off, and Dorothy and Billina find they're not alone in their hiding place, as a metal man is standing there dormant. But don't confuse this guy with the Tin Man. They are very different. Dorothy reads the crest that says he's part of the Royal Army of Oz, along with a motto that says Semper Honor, meaning always honor. It evokes the thought of a Marine Corps, as their motto is Semper Fidelis, or Semper Fi, which means always faithful or always loyal. So that certainly gives the Metal Man a kind of gravitas already. Oh, and you know how it says the Royal Army of Oz?
Yeah, that doesn't mean he's part of the army. That means he's the entire Army of Oz. Which, if that's the case, it's hardly surprising the city was razed to the ground. I mean, no offense to the guy, but one man does not an army make. Also, the army aspect of the character is not in the books.
On the back of the Metal Man, Dorothy finds some directions, which firstly state the mechanical man does everything but live, which is from the books as well, but it always felt like a needlessly mean thing to say. The directions state that 3 keys activate its clockwork mechanisms. Oh yeah, this sucker's clockwork. Each key corresponds to a different part: speech, thought, and action.
And I could be wrong on this one, but people from the real world do seem to have Oz counterparts, which is what we saw with the Orderly. So, to me, it feels like this mechanical man is the Oz counterpart to the machine that Dorothy was shown by Dr. Worley.
But I am basing that purely on the fact that they both have mechanical keys.
You could also argue that if Oz is in Dorothy's head, she took this dangerous, unknown electrical machine of her world and made it mechanical, clockwork, and understandable, and in her mind, safe in Oz. That theory only really works, though, if you believe Oz is a figment of her imagination.
Dorothy decides to wind the man up, and by that I don't mean irritate the hell out of him. She starts with his thinking, which doesn't seem to do much, and then his speech. And he seems to know who Dorothy is, introducing himself.
Pleased to meet you. I am Tick-Tock, the Royal Army of Oz.
Yes, his name is Tick-Tock. But don't worry, he's not going to start jigging about to a pop song. Tick-Tock, the character, that is, makes frequent appearances in the Oz books, including having one of his own simply titled Tick-Tock of Oz, and Ozma of Oz was his first appearance, being found by Dorothy in pretty much the exact same way. Also, it should be noted that TikTok is one of the earliest depictions of a robot in literature. So early, in fact, that the word robot hadn't even been invented yet.
According to TikTok, the Scarecrow, who is the current ruler of Oz, put him in the secret room to wait for Dorothy. But sadly, because of this, he doesn't really know what's going on, just that everyone started to turn to stone. Also, because he's not alive, he didn't get to turn to stone like the others. Dorothy winds up TikTok's actions so they might get out of there, but they still have the Wheelers to contend with. But TikTok pledges to protect Dorothy and comes up with a plan. He takes Dorothy's lunch pail and leads the way, waddling outside.
One of the most amazing things about TikTok is how they managed to get him to move. As you might expect, there is a man inside the body of TikTok moving the legs. However, rather bizarrely, the man, Michael Sundin, who is a gymnast, is actually facing backwards with his back bent, upside down, with his hands in the feet. Just think about that every time you see this guy moving, seemingly without effort.
They get outside and it doesn't take long for the Wheelers to attack. Fortunately, TikTok is able to handle them, and they're not very bright either, as he just spins his upper body, hitting them with the lunch pail, taking the lead Wheeler captive, forcing the others to back off. The lead Wheeler is able to give some answers about what happened, saying that the Gnome King conquered the city and turned everyone to stone. Dorothy wants to know where the Scarecrow is, and the Wheeler tells them there's only one person who knows where he is.
Even her name is a combination of sorts of the two characters she's based on, because in the books, Mombi isn't a princess, she's just a witch. The princess part comes from, as I said before, Princess Languidire. Although for the film, Mombi has just seemingly taken the princess moniker for herself.
TikTok forces the Wheeler to take them to where Mombi is, which he really doesn't want to do, squirming and trying to get away when they knock on her gate. And interestingly, they're not very far from where they were before. See, you can see the statues. They could have just gotten the Wheeler to point at the building, really. They get inside, and Bellina says it right.
This Mombi is some housekeeper.
As the place, although looking better than the outside, is still covered in cobwebs and dust. They find their way into a large mirrored ballroom, which must have been a nightmare to film in. And there's a woman waiting for them playing, I think, a balalaika, but it could be some kind of fictional instrument. She's also wearing a ridiculously impractical dress, one covered in spikes, which might explain why she's on her own, as she's a walking stab risk. But they were going for a dangerous but elegant look to her costume, I guess. Dorothy asks if she is Mombi, but she doesn't answer, just says she wants to put on something more appropriate, taking Dorothy with her, leaving TikTok and Bellina in the ballroom. We soon find out what she means when Dorothy is taken to her headroom, where there are many heads on display, all of which are still alive. The film makes a point of showing Mombi using a red key to open the cabinet as she places her current head on the pedestal.
Now, I mentioned this in my Jumanji review, but this scene doesn't look as good as it did in the cinemas purely because of HD.
Because you can clearly see the pedestal is actually part of a blacked out box where the actress is standing behind and sticking her head through. It is admittedly a clever effect.
And I do think if you were seeing this film originally, and certainly on lower definition screens, this effect would be far more convincing. It's just, sadly, one of those things that hasn't aged well.
Mombi gets her new head, freaking out Dorothy a bit with it talking, and when Dorothy tells her who she is, that seems to get her attention. She tells Dorothy that the Gnome King took the Scarecrow and all the emeralds back to his mountain, and then she gets creepier, talking about Dorothy's attractiveness, saying she's going to lock her in the tower to wait for her head to mature so she can take it. Dorothy naturally doesn't like that idea and tries to run away. Bellina and TikTok try and help, with the former attacking Mombi. Unfortunately, just before TikTok can help, his action runs down. I do think that laugh tells you everything you need to know about Mombi. Dorothy is put in the tower, which coincidentally also happened to her in the first movie, and looking out the window she can see across the deadly desert to the Gnome King's mountain. And while looking around, Dorothy finds an old painting of the Tin Man, Scarecrow and Cowardly Lion, and it's very in keeping with the style of the original books, so it's a nice touch. Dorothy hears someone else in the tower calling for their mom, and it's a pumpkin-headed fellow who at first thinks Dorothy is his mother, but is soon corrected, and in fact his name is Jack Pumpkinhead.
For the longest time, I thought this film had some connection to the Jim Henson Company because the puppets do feel like their kind of style, but apparently there's no affiliation, except that Jack Pumpkinhead here is voiced by Brian Henson, executive producer of the Jim Henson Company. And he gives Jack's voice this sort of soft, calm demeanour that really juxtaposes the initial scary appearance of Jack.
Oh, for a second there, I thought my mom had come back.
Also, Tim Burton has said that Jack was the inspiration for Jack Skellington of Nightmare Before Christmas fame. It just shows how influential this film was on popular culture. Oh, and here's another one.
George Lucas was brought to set one day to have a look around, and while doing so he met Rick McCallum, and they would go on to make the Star Wars prequels.
So, yeah. They can't all be good influences.
Jack asks Dorothy if she can put the rest of him back together, as he's a bit all over the place currently. And he tells Dorothy about his creation. His mother made him so he would scare Mombi, and he succeeded. But then Mombi tested the powder of life on him as revenge, which animated him, and then she stuck him in the tower.
Which, when you think about it, is an incredibly sadistic thing to do. Give something life and then lock it away. It really shows what Mombi is capable of. Also, this origin for Jack is almost identical to that in the book. However, there, he was made by a boy called Tipitarius, Tip for short. But there's more to be said about that later.
Jack also explains how Mombi got her heads, referring back to the decapitated dancing statues earlier.
Which doesn't actually make much sense. There were only 6 statues, and Mombi's got way more than 6 heads, so where did the other heads come from exactly? I guess we're just to assume that she's a bit of a head collector.
Dorothy asks Jack if there's any more powder of life, and he says Mombi keeps it with her original head. Dorothy then formulates a plan, looking at a mounted animal head and a couch nearby. So with the help of Jack, they manage to get out of the tower, making their way back into the ballroom. And while sneaking around, Jack has a rather strange request.
May I call you Mom, even if it isn't so?
Which I know is supposed to be an innocent request, but it always creeped me out for someone to ask that of a 9-year-old girl. It's just odd. They manage to get TikTok up and running, and he and Jack go back upstairs to put Dorothy's plan into action while she gets the powder of life. Speaking of which, Dorothy has found Mombi sleeping and without her head, no less. But she can see the cabinet key, and while she tries to retrieve it, Jack and TikTok are making some kind of flying creature, using 2 couches, leaves for wings, and the animal head, which TikTok says is the head of a gump.
The flying creature they're making is from the Marvelous Land of Oz, and it's pretty much identical as it is in the book. And because it's in the book, it means that this joke is not intended, but here goes. The gump comes from the Ozian forest, which makes it a forest gump.
Anyway, back with Dorothy, she manages to get the key from Mombi's body, and in the tower, things aren't going well, as TikTok starts making nonsensical orders, like tie Jack's feet together, and then he just starts spouting gibberish. Unaware of the wrench in her plan, Dorothy makes her way into Mombi's headroom. All the heads are currently sleeping, fortunately, and Dorothy finds the cabinet holding Mombi's original head, Cabinet 31.
The same number as Dorothy's room in the hospital, might I add, and it's interesting that Mombi keeps her head locked away, not even on display. It's almost like she's ashamed of herself and doesn't even want to look at her own face, preferring a mirror for her new face.
Inside the cabinet, Dorothy is shocked to discover that Mombi's head is the same as Nurse Wilson. She recovers from her surprise as she reaches for the powder of life. Unfortunately, she knocks over a bottle, waking Mombi's head up. And I must admit, this would be pretty damn scary for any kid in the audience, especially as Mombi's headless body starts walking around trying to grab Dorothy. The room of screaming heads is just icing on this terrifying cake. Being without a head has stalled Mombi somewhat, as Dorothy runs back to the ballroom, but as all the mirrors look the same, she has trouble finding the secret passage. That is until something blurry and ghost-like shows her the correct way. In the tower, Dorothy discovers that the creature is unfinished, and as Belina puts it,
TikTok went berserk.
Dorothy correctly identifies that TikTok's thinking must have run down.
If his brains ran down, how could he talk?
It happens to people all the time, Jack.
Now that is just the perfect way to get across the idea of mental health to a young audience. It's such a simple explanation, but it makes it so clear.
Dorothy manages to fix TikTok and she starts sprinkling the powder of life on the creature, but it doesn't seem to work. Belina quite wisely tells her to read the directions, and they are a specific set of words you need to say to get the powder to work.
Weog, Teog, Peog.
Which is the same incantation as in the book, although there's a few hand movements to accompany it. And just to make it clear how difficult it is to acquire powder of life, we're told in the books that you need 4 separate pots of ingredients stirred constantly for 6 years until all the liquid has boiled away and you get about a handful of powder. So yeah, it's a hell of a commitment if you want some of this stuff.
Meanwhile, Mombi has smashed the cabinet in order to get to her original head, and she's on her way, and it doesn't take her long to burst into the tower, but the Gump has learned how to move quite quickly and breaks out of the tower, at first looking like he can't fly, cause let's be honest, his wings are just palm leaves. But fortunately, it does indeed fly as they manage to make their escape. But Mombi's not giving up yet as she wakes up her Wheeler minions to chase them. And while flying, the Gump is getting all existential, wondering what exactly he is now, not feeling particularly well put together, which I'm sure won't be a problem later. Dorothy tells the Gump to keep flying straight ahead to the Gnome King's mountain. Well, that's where they're trying to fly to. It's a bit tricky at night. And Belina asks why they can't just fly back home, which might be a reference to the books, because there, the Gump did accidentally fly the Scarecrow and Tin Man back to our world. But anyway, after the ordeal, Dorothy manages to fall asleep. Back with Mombi, who is playing her balalaika again, so not in any kind of rush, I guess, and the ghostly image in the mirror appears again, who Mombi addresses as Ozma, and she remains confident that no one can help because no one knows who she is.
Which is an interesting change from the book, because there, Mombi was indeed charged with hiding Ozma, but she didn't just stick her in a mirror. Because remember that boy I mentioned, Tipitarius, who made Jack Pumpkinhead? Yeah, turns out that's Ozma made into a boy by Mombi to hide her. So Ozma is indeed Jack's mom, and despite Tip not being in the film, that's pretty accurate to the novel.
Meanwhile, on the ground, the Wheelers are chasing the Gump, but it doesn't take long until they're over the deadly desert, which several Wheelers fall into, and we get to see what the desert is actually capable of.
Well, that was horrifying. But again, nothing that wasn't already in the books, so suck it, critics. And yes, I see the irony in me, a critic, saying that, but whatever.
Safe for now, Jack covers Dorothy up so she can sleep. However, the ropes are starting to come undone.
I want to talk about the powder of life and the deadly desert for a second, because they say that the powder of life gives life to objects, and the deadly desert turns anything living into sand. They specifically say living, and they also specifically say that TikTok does everything but live. Now, to me, that feels like a setup for later. Like, for example, they fall into the deadly desert and they need TikTok's help to get out of it because he's unaffected by the sand. Or, even better, they use the powder of life on TikTok, so he's no longer beholden to his mechanisms. But no, it's set up like a Chekhov's gun, but it never fires. Nothing ever comes from it, which I always found a bit disappointing, really.
In the morning, things have gotten chaotic as the Gump starts to fall apart, and TikTok tries his best to hold things together, but when Jack grabs for another rope, he quite literally loses his head over the side. Although he's unsure how to turn, Dorothy gets the Gump to fly after him, and fortunately they do catch up to Jack's head, grabbing it just as the Gump finally collapses. They all start falling out of the sky, and Dorothy seems rather calm for someone falling to their death.
It's all right, Jack! It can't be helped now!
But surprise, surprise, they all manage to land safely on the Gnome King's mountain, although the Gump may have lost several limbs in the process. It doesn't take long for them to realize they made it to the Gnome King's mountain, and deep inside the mountain, the Gnome King sends his messenger to investigate all the noise. And he finds our group discussing what they should do with the Gump's head, deciding to attach him to the remaining couch. The messenger tells the king what he found, but most importantly, he tells the king that there's no sign of the chicken. We have yet to be told why the Gnome King hates chickens so much.
Now, the messenger didn't see Melina, despite us seeing her moments earlier, because in a deleted scene, she decides to sit in Jack's head for warmth. It doesn't really change anything, but it is a little bit confusing how she just disappears between scenes.
Now the Gnome King knows the coast is clear of chickens, he finally makes his presence known, appearing on the side of the mountain to ask who they all are and why they're there. And despite the fact that he is literally a big talking face on the side of the mountain, Dorothy and the others react as if they can't see him, which I suspect is because they weren't sure what the effect was at the time of filming, so just acted like it was a disembodied voice. It does get corrected though soon after. The Gnome King knows Dorothy, and she asks him to release the Scarecrow and restore the Emerald City. However, the Gnome King just straight up says he doesn't want to. So Dorothy tries a different tactic. Threats.
When we are here with our army to conquer you and force you to give it back.
To which the Gnome King laughs uproariously at, quite rightfully some might say, but as he laughs, he causes an earthquake as the mountain literally swallows up Dorothy and her friends as they fall into the center of the mountain and the Gnome King's domain. While Dorothy falls, the Gnome King explains his position. He says all precious stones are mined in the mountain by his gnomes, specifically for him, so all the emeralds in the Emerald City belong to the Gnome King.
I mean, he does kinda have a point here. I guess it would depend on whether you think he can claim ownership of natural minerals. Also, it's never really specified if the Emerald City took the emeralds after they were mined by gnomes.
Eventually, Dorothy lands, sliding into the Gnome King's chamber and straight into the Scarecrow's arms, but the Gnome King makes him disappear just as quickly. The Gnome King claims the Scarecrow is the thief of all his emeralds because he was ruler at the time, and he transformed the Scarecrow into an ornament in his palace.
Firstly, the Gnome King is played by Nicole Williamson, so just like Mombi, Dr. Wally gets an evil Oz counterpart, and his messenger is also played by Pons Ma. But I wanted to talk about the stop-motion animation here for a second.
Poor Dorothy Day. All's not lost.
The Claymation was directed by Will Vinton, who was quite the Claymation legend, even winning an Oscar for his work. And the way the Claymation was done for Return to Oz is he had Nicole Williamson and Pons Ma say their lines in front of a grid, and then the Claymation artist would recreate their expressions in the clay, which is just mind-blowing to think about, and will get even more amazing as the animation gets more and more elaborate.
The Gnome King thanks Dorothy for reminding him to imprison the Scarecrow, which certainly feels like him twisting in the knife in there. And Dorothy tries attacking him, but he just shrinks into the rock.
Before we get into the Gnome King's nitty-gritty, one thing that's quite clever about the chamber that they're in is that it's based on actual natural rock formations. Fingal's Cave in Scotland and the Giant's Causeway in Ireland are composed of interlocking basalt columns, all naturally forming. And yeah, to the eye of a child, those locations could look like some manufactured palace for an evil king of gnomes.
Dorothy tries to tell the Gnome King that the emeralds were there before the Scarecrow became ruler, and Dorothy's crying seems to affect the Gnome King, and he decides to try and cheer her up.
Although I think he's just being a manipulative dick.
The others slide into the chamber, and the Gnome King says they can play a game, risking something to save the Scarecrow, without saying what the risk is, of course. Meanwhile, the Wheelers have returned to Mombi to tell her that Dorothy got to the mountain, and Mombi needs to warn the Gnome King about Belina. Again, still haven't been told why chickens are so bad. Back at the mountain, the Gnome King explains the rules of the game. Each of them can go into the ornament room. They need to touch an object and say Oz to restore the Scarecrow, but they only have 3 guesses.
And predictably, the Gnome King leaves out what happens to them if they don't find the Scarecrow within those 3 guesses, because, as I said, he's a bit of a dick like that.
And of course, the hands clawing away at the rock to make an entrance to the ornament room doesn't really inspire confidence either. It's the Gump who goes first, and while they wait, the king offers up some refreshment, limestone pie, which Dorothy takes a bite of and seems to enjoy. It also sounds like a stone-based pun on key lime pie. And what else is there?
Hot, melted silver.
Yeah, don't drink that. It's possible the Gnome King has made everything suitable for human and non-gnome consumption, but when it's just called melted silver without even a pun, I get a little suspicious.
Dorothy quite wisely puts the cup down as far away as possible. There's then a loud booming sound, which seems to please the Gnome King as he rubs his hands together, and TikTok gets to the crux of the matter, asking what the risk the king mentioned was. But before anything else can be said, a huge crash of lightning throws everybody about, and for some reason, the Gnome King begins to look more human, as he calls for the next participant. The Gump doesn't come out of the ornament room, and this is when the Gnome King tells them of the risk. The Gump is now an ornament, and that's what will happen to all of them if they fail to find the Scarecrow. Dorothy cries foul, but the king pulls out the old "you didn't ask" excuse, threatening to throw them into a fiery furnace.
So yeah, they've really hammered home now that the Gnome King is not a nice person, and in fact, a lot of his actions mirror his Kansas counterpart in quite a few ways.
Next up is Jack. There's a brief moment of despair from Jack, who all but assumes Dorothy will become an ornament like the rest of them. But Dorothy wishes him good luck, to Bellina as well, and at the same time, Mombi is charging to the mountain on her wheeler-powered wagon.
And the tunnel is consistent with the book, where it said that the Gnome King tunneled underneath the Deadly Desert in order to invade the Emerald City. And now there's a convenient tunnel to use.
Jack is sent into the ornament room with Dorothy and TikTok not really optimistic of his chances.
He has many excellent qualities, but thinking is not one of them.
The booming sounds are heard as the Gnome King counts down Jack's guesses. While they wait, Dorothy gives TikTok's works a winding, but notice how it's only his thinking that gets wound up. And she remarks how his problem with winding down is the main problem with his design, and only if he could wind himself up.
Which again is the perfect setup for Dorothy to give TikTok life. Hell, it would be a nice parallel to the end of the first film, where everyone received something that they needed. There aren't many missteps in this film, but this is one of them. And yes, you could argue that in the books, TikTok was never given life, but the film version of Mombi never existed either. Just give the guy a break, it's all I ask.
Another strike of lightning occurs, and now the Gnome King is more human-looking, and actually played by Nicole Williamson now, and not just his voice, which gives the Claymation guy a break at least. Next into the ornament room is TikTok, who's a little more confident than the others, and then Dorothy is left alone with the Gnome King. The Gnome King is now smoking a pipe, and it's very deliberately made to look like the same pipe that Dr. Worley was smoking. It's not the same pipe, so this isn't a coincidence. For the Gnome King, it's been made larger and more imposing looking, in some ways how a child might see it. And the fact that it's a claw holding something is very appropriate given the circumstances. The Gnome King asks Dorothy why she came to his mountain because he doesn't believe her that she's there just for the Scarecrow. He thinks she came to take back the ruby slippers, which he happens to be wearing. Turns out they just fell out of the sky one day.
And this is what I meant when I mentioned that Dr. Worley had a ruby ring. Although the Gnome King also has a ruby ring, so maybe I'm clutching at straws a bit. But the point is that the entire events of the film are inadvertently Dorothy's fault. Also, in the book, the Gnome King never gets the silver shoes, but he does have his own silver belt, which grants the wearer 1 wish per day. And in an earlier script draft for the film, the Gnome King was going to cut up the ruby slippers to make a ruby belt instead. And I think we can all agree that a ruby belt would suit him a lot better than the slippers, because seriously, every time I see him wearing those, this happens in my head.
I'm just a sweet transvestite.
It's then another gnome appears behind the king with an interesting development. It turns out TikTok has stopped moving. Dorothy wound up his thoughts, but not his actions, so he must have run down. The king offers to let her go in and fix the problem, and then she can make her guesses too. But it's not really much of an offer, she doesn't have much choice. Well, that is until the Gnome King poses an ultimatum. She could go in and make her guesses, or he could use the ruby slippers to send her home, and
when you get back, you will never think of Oz again.
The Gnome King offering to wipe Dorothy's memory of Oz and her friends is a nice parallel to what Dr. Worley was going to do, and from Dorothy's perspective, those two things are the exact same.
Dorothy refuses the Gnome King's offer without a word, going into the ornament room, and inside she finds Tick-Tock, but turns out he's got a bit of craftiness in his cogs, as he pretended to run down in order to get Dorothy in the ornament room with him, as he has a plan. Tick-Tock has one guess left, so if he guesses wrong and gets turned into an ornament, Dorothy will see what it is and guess the rest. Dorothy gives him a hug and Tick-Tock starts to cry. At least I hope it's crying, otherwise there's a bit of an internal mechanical problem.
Don't cry.
Which is a nice reference to the end of the first film too, where Dorothy says that to the Tin Man. It's then time for Tick-Tock to make his final guess, choosing a cup. However, there's a problem. When Tick-Tock makes his guess, lightning flashes and the place goes dark for a second. And when Dorothy can see again, Tick-Tock is gone, with no way of knowing what he turned into. And the Gnome King is now almost completely human.
It's implied in the film that the Gnome King was once human and he's trying to return to that form. However, this aspect of the character is a complete invention of the film. After all, in the books, he looks pretty much human already.
And at long last, Mombi finally reaches the mountain, demanding to see the Gnome King. And at the same time, Dorothy makes her first choice, which is incorrect. And in the Gnome King's chamber, he tells Mombi to kneel, really enjoying getting her to kneel as low as possible. He's confident in victory, and with Dorothy making her second incorrect choice, his confidence is even higher. Mombi tries to tell him that Dorothy is headed his way, taking a second to realise he knows all about that, and is more than sure the problem will be resolved shortly. In the ornament room, Dorothy has resorted to literal blind luck, spinning in a circle, and then with her eyes closed, tries to grab an object, at first knocking over a green gem, but grabbing a metal bird. And she's about to guess again, but something causes her to change her mind to the gem.
Dorothy!
Places.
I love that as soon as Dorothy guesses correctly, you can see that the Gnome King has reverted back to his previous form. Also, with the Scarecrow, I feel he's a bit more creepy than he's supposed to be, because originally he was supposed to have a fully animatronic face.
However, the budget wouldn't stretch that far, so instead he just has interchangeable faces between shots that remain static while on camera.
So yeah, through no fault of their own, the Scarecrow is a little bit extra disturbing with his unmoving rictus grin and dead eyes.
Dorothy realises that the Scarecrow was a green object, so everyone trapped must be green as well, so they start looking, while the Gnome King throws his pipe in anger. The Scarecrow finds another green object, and Dorothy's guess brings back the Gump, and now it's safe to say the Gnome King is pissed, blaming Mombi for letting her escape, trapping her in a steel cage as the whole mountain begins to shake from the Gnome King's fury. The place begins to fall apart with the ornaments falling about, and the Scarecrow sees a green vase about to fall, grabbing it just in time. Dorothy uses it to bring back Jack as the big head of the Gnome King appears over the rubble, all fire and brimstone. Literally, probably, demanding Dorothy stop. And yeah, now that Dorothy is winning his game, he's gone all Darth Vader on her.
I am altering the deal. Pray I don't alter it any further.
Now he just threatens to eat them all. He tries to take the Gump, but he only manages to get the sofa as the others pull his head off. He then wants to eat Jack. They all run, but the Gnome King calls his gnomes to grow out of the walls, blocking their escape, and eventually the Gnome King grabs Jack by the ankles, looking to lower Jack into his hideous gaping maw. However, he hears Bellina in Jack's head, and she finally lays an egg, overcoming her issues as it falls into the Gnome King's mouth. And this is where we finally learn why chickens aren't allowed in Oz.
Eggs are poison. Poison to gnomes.
Yes, eggs are poison to gnomes, for some reason. I don't think it's ever really explained, but does it need an explanation? It's kind of like the Wicked Witch of the West and how she's killed with water. In the Oz series, you just have to accept these kinds of things.
And eggs must be really poisonous because it doesn't take long for the Gnome King to completely disintegrate and fall into the fire, which again is something stated in the books. It says if the inside of an egg even touches a gnome, he withers up and blows away. And in the rubble, Dorothy sees the ruby slippers, and quickly putting them on, she makes a wish to get everyone from Oz to return there safely, but also to restore the Emerald City and all its people back to normal.
Which technically is 3 wishes, but I guess the rules around the ruby slippers are a bit nebulous, so it's allowed. Also, a few more bits of trivia about the ruby slippers. They were actually rotoscoped to make them a bit more magical. Also, they were handmade with imitation rubies, and it was attached with spray adhesive that was so problematic they kept falling off, so the prop department made sure they were only worn specifically when they were on camera. Also, Firuza Balk got to keep a pair.
We then get to see all the statues restored. Fortunately, the dancing women are reunited with their heads, otherwise that would have been a disaster. And the Cowardly Lion and the Tin Man are restored too, along with the rest of the city. Dorothy and the others are then safely transported to pretty much the exact spot where Dorothy and Billina entered Oz in the first place. Oh, and we can't forget Mombi still locked up in her cage. But they never found TikTok before all hell broke loose. But if you remember Dorothy's wish, she said everyone from Oz to return there safely. And on the Gump's antler, there's, appropriately enough, a medal. And in a nice touch, the medal says Semper Honor, just like TikTok's crest. And thus, TikTok is restored by Dorothy. And back in the Emerald City, it's thriving again, as a huge procession has been given for Dorothy, and it's quite the reference extravaganza.
It would take too long to show them all, but just take my word for it that in the crowd for the parade, you can see Braided Man, Button Bright, Cap'n Bill holding the magic flower, and yes, these are all legitimate characters, Frogman, Glinda, some Munchkins, Not a Bit More, Polychrome, Patchwork Girl, Shaggy Man, and Tommy Quickstep, all of which Disney couldn't show with any prominence because they were still under copyright.
And at the front of the parade, Dorothy is riding the Cowardly Lion with a shiny TikTok leading.
And here's another little behind-the-scenes detail. During this scene, the set was so stiflingly hot. Well, I'll just let Firuza Balk tell you.
I was sitting on and I'm waving and I'm happy, and all of a sudden I just kind of went, and I just fell off, and everyone came running up, wake up, just because it was hot, but I was so embarrassed.
Eventually the crowd get to the Mirror Ballroom and everyone shouts for Dorothy to be the Queen of Oz, which is quite a bit of pressure to put on a young girl. But she politely refuses, saying she has to return home, and then, possibly, accidentally makes a wish.
I wish I could be in both places at the same time.
And that's when the crowd see Ozma in the mirror, acting like Dorothy's reflection.
Now, I can't be the only one to see the implication here that Ozma is Dorothy's Oz-based counterpart. You know how Mombi and the Gnome King have counterparts? And that's certainly something not in the books, I can tell you.
It also turns out that the girl who helped Dorothy in the hospital was Ozma. Somehow. That's never really explained. Also, the fact that she's stuck in a mirror might explain why she appeared only after Dorothy saw her reflection. And with Dorothy's help, Ozma emerges from the mirror, and when she reveals who she is, Jack realizes that's his actual mother, fainting in the process. Which again, bit young, kinda weird, but moving on. It's then Mombi's new jailers, who are appropriately the women whose heads she stole, confirm Ozma is the rightful ruler of Oz, and she says that Mombi is adequately punished because she's been stripped of her powers. And finally, Dorothy gives Ozma the ruby slippers and asks to be wished back to Kansas, and Ozma says if she ever wants to come back, she can.
And in fact, in the books, Dorothy eventually moves to Oz permanently with Aunt Em and Uncle Henry because the farm was foreclosed on, which is convenient for them.
Billina is also staying in Oz now too, which, to be honest, choosing between being carried around on a gilded pillow and dusty chicken coop in Kansas, it's hardly a choice at all. And Ozma clicks her heels, and Dorothy has to hurriedly say goodbye to everyone before being sent back home.
That always felt a bit abrupt to me. She could have at least given her a bit of warning before catapulting her back home.
Back in Kansas, it's now the morning after Dorothy left as she wakes up on the banks of the river. She's found by Toto and then Uncle Henry, who throws away his walking stick when he sees she's safe, and he's running like his leg was never broken, having overcome his issues, regaining his spirit. Now safe, Aunt Em explains what happened to the clinic. It was hit by lightning and burned to the ground, and Dr. Worley, obsessed with his machines, died in the fire trying to save them, mirroring the Gnome King's fate. And Dorothy sees Nurse Wilson being taken away by the police.
However, we're never really told why. Obviously it's to mirror the imprisonment of Mombi, but there's no real reason to lock the nurse up. Except if you read the novelization, because there it says that the clinic was engaging in inhumane experiments, and the victims of these experiments were being held in the basement by Dr. Worley and Nurse Wilson.
In fact, you can see her coming out of the basement after checking on these prisoners when she starts chasing Dorothy and Ozma.
And that's another parallel with the Gnome King. Dr. Worley inviting people to his clinic to help them, but they all end up as his prisoner, just like the Gnome King and his ornament room.
And the film ends with the farmhouse being rebuilt and Dorothy sees Ozma and Billina watching her through the mirror. She initially calls Aunt Em to see, but Ozma tells her to keep it a secret, and Aunt Em tells Dorothy and Toto to go outside as they run around together.
So that was Return to Oz. It's dark, scary, and an absolute perfect love letter to the books of Frank L. Baum.
I believe that Frank L. Baum understood that children can not only handle a bit of darkness in their fiction, but actually enjoy it. And Walter Murch recreated that beautifully for this film. Yes, it's dark and creepy, but it's also an amazing recreation of the books. And anyone who says this film is too dark for kids, I'm looking at you, Siskel and Ebert, are quite frankly talking out of their arse. Kids are stronger than some people give them credit for.
The performances are simply iconic as well, with Fairuza Balk just knocking it out of the park, and in her first movie no less. I'm not going to say she's better than Judy Garland because they are very different characters with very different styles of performance, but I will say she deserves to be as well remembered for Dorothy. Better or worse is debatable, but she's certainly a more accurate portrayal of Dorothy.
The villains for this film, the Gnome King, Mombi, and the Wheelers, are etched into people's minds for a reason. They're damn good villains. I don't think anyone watching this for the first time ever doubted what these characters were capable of. They were always given the right amount of gravitas and never reduced to punchlines. And of course, they were made scary, which is important.
When growing up, I remember people having such affection for the original Wizard of Oz film. Well, this film gets my affection. And I hope I've given you all a good enough reason why it deserves yours as well. Thank you so much for watching. I'd like to give a massive thank you to all my Patreon donators. Their support really does help a lot. And if you would like to contribute to the channel and gain access to the Deusdaecon Reviews Discord server, the link is in the description below. Also, I'm currently at university right now, working on a forensics degree, so obviously all content is a little slow and difficult to get to you. All I can say is I'm still continuing to work on things, so more videos are on the way, and I thank you so much for your patience with that. And of course, I continue to stream live on Twitch when I can, where things are just as efficient and coordinated as this. Shit, I'm gonna die. You just killed me, you bastard. But it's functional, for God's sake. You son of a bitch. At least my grave floats. It's not the Chelsea Flowers show. It's Valheim, for God's sake. It doesn't have to look pretty, just as long as it fucking works. You made that impossible. I couldn't do that. You killed me, you bastard. The link is in the description below, so hopefully I will see you there. And on YouTube, I'll see you next time.